It feels strange to even write this down. It's like the weight of everything that's happened has finally caught up with me. I guess part of me thought that if I didn't acknowledge it, it would somehow go away. But it hasn't. It's been eating away at me, and I think it's time to tell the story. To let someone know what happened, even if it's just a post on Reddit. Maybe writing it out will help me make sense of it all. Let's start from the beginning, because everything that went wrong really began there, even if I didn't see it at the time. Amy and I have been married for 5 years now. We live in a quiet little suburb. It's not glamorous, but it's comfortable, and we've built a decent life together. I'm an accountant, and I've always worked long hours. The office has always been my second home, but it's just the way I am. I like being thorough, making sure everything's done right. I've always thought Amy understood that. She's an interior designer, and her work is her passion. The only problem is, she's been slipping away from me. It started out small, like when she'd ask me how my day was, and I'd just mumble something about work and get back to whatever I was doing. Or when she'd suggest going on a weekend trip, but I'd tell her I had too much work to do. We used to travel a lot, just the two of us. It was how we connected. But the more time I spent at the office, the more I started to see her as just another thing I could put off. And I didn't even realize I was doing it. Amy would try to talk to me about it, sometimes in the middle of dinner or late at night when I was trying to unwind. She'd bring up how she felt distant, how she missed the old US. I always brushed her off. I'd tell her it was just a rough patch, that we'd get back to normal eventually. But deep down, I think I knew that wasn't going to happen. I didn't know what to do, but I also didn't want to deal with it. I just wanted to keep going. One day, Amy asked me point blank if I thought our marriage was still working. I remember the look in her eyes. It was like she was pleading for me to care. But I didn't. At least not enough to change anything. "Do you even hear me anymore?" she asked, and I could hear the frustration in her voice. I didn't answer right away. I just kept scrolling through my emails. I wasn't even looking at her. And that's when it hit me. She was right. I hadn't been listening. I hadn't been present. But that was just the start. Then came the family gathering. It was one of those rare occasions when the whole family would get together at my parents' house. There was my brother, my parents, and of course, Kyle. Kyle's my cousin. He's always been the life of the party, charismatic, funny, and a bit of a show-off. He's one of those people everyone wants to be around. The guy has this effortless charm, and he can talk to anyone about anything. I've always liked him, even though I've never really understood how he manages to get along with everyone so easily. That day, though, something changed. Amy had been acting distant for weeks, but I didn't notice until we got to my parents' place. It's not like we were talking much, but I could see her eyes following Kyle across the room. And Kyle? He was all over her, laughing at her jokes, asking her questions about her work. They spent most of the evening talking, and I didn't think much of it at first. It seemed harmless. Kyle had always been a bit of a flirt, but Amy was different. She wasn't like that. Or at least, I thought she wasn't. As the night wore on, I noticed something else. She seemed lighter, happier, like she was actually enjoying herself. For the first time in a while, she wasn't staring at her phone or sighing like she had something better to do. I remember thinking it was nice to see her having fun, but I couldn't quite put my finger on why it made me feel uneasy. After the family celebration, things started to shift. Amy and Kyle kept in touch. I didn't think anything of it at first. They'd exchange texts here and there, usually about work stuff or ideas for new projects. Amy had always been passionate about her career, so it made sense that Kyle, being in the same creative space, would want to talk shop. But then I started noticing the late-night messages, the little things that didn't seem so innocent anymore. She was telling him things she never told me. About her projects. About how she was feeling. About how she wished she could talk to someone who understood her better. The worst part was, I wasn't listening. I wasn't even aware that I was losing her. I was too busy with work, too busy with my own problems to realize that Amy had already started confiding in someone else. And Kyle? He was more than happy to play the part. He was charming, funny, and attentive. Everything I wasn't anymore. A few weeks later, Kyle invited Amy to an art exhibition. He said it would be a good opportunity to see some of the work she'd been talking about. She agreed, and I didn't think much of it. But as she left the house that night, something in my gut told me it wasn't just about the exhibition. When she got home later that evening, she was different. Not in a bad way, but in a way I couldn't quite explain. She smiled more. She looked alive. And when I asked her how the night had gone, she told me everything was fine. But I could see the way she avoided my eyes, like she wasn't telling the whole truth. I didn't push it. I didn't want to cause a scene. But I knew something was happening, and it wasn't good. One night, after we'd both gotten home from work, Amy tried to talk to me again. This time, she was upset. She told me she felt alone. She said she needed more from me, more attention, more effort. She was tired of feeling like I didn't care. I told her I was busy. I told her I had too much going on at work. But deep down, I knew she was right. I'm not asking for the world, Alex. I just need you to listen. I didn't listen. Not that night. I didn't listen then, and I didn't listen in the weeks that followed. I should have seen it coming, but I didn't. If you had asked me back then, I would have sworn that I'd seen it all, that nothing could catch me by surprise anymore. But I was wrong. I couldn't have been more wrong. The things I'd been too blind to see, those little moments, those small signs, were nothing compared to the bombshell that was about to drop. It started with the art exhibition. The thing is, when Amy left, I didn't think much of it. I trusted her, even though I was starting to notice the distance between us. But that night, when she came home from the trip, I knew something had changed. It wasn't just the look in her eyes or the way she smiled. No, it was something more subtle. She wasn't just tired from a trip. She was different. And I didn't understand why until much later. Amy and Kyle had spent a lot of time together on that trip. They had walked around the city, just the two of them. Kyle was, as always, that charming guy who could talk about anything and make you feel like you were the most important person in the room. But this time, Amy had let herself get swept up in it. She'd let herself be the one who was listened to, the one who mattered. After dinner at a cafe, they'd gone back to the hotel. And that's where everything changed. Kyle confessed something that night, something that shook Amy to the core. He told her that he'd been harboring feelings for her for a long time. The way he said it, the way he looked at her, made her feel desired in a way I hadn't in months, maybe even longer. It was one of those moments where everything else fades away, and it's just you and that person. No distractions, no second thoughts. In that moment, she didn't have to worry about anything. She didn't have to think about the problems she was facing with me or the loneliness she'd been feeling. For the first time in a long time, someone was making her feel wanted. I don't think she wanted it to happen. I don't think she planned for it. But in the moment, it didn't matter. They crossed that line, and that was it. The next morning, she woke up in a hotel room, filled with regret and confusion. I can only imagine how it felt for her. The guilt, the shame, the conflict. But there was something else too. There was a thrill in it. A part of her had been awakened. She had been given something that she thought she needed, something I couldn't give her. When she came back home, she was different. She tried to avoid me. She couldn't meet my eyes, couldn't hold a conversation without fidgeting. But when I asked how the trip went, she gave me the same vague answers, the ones she thought would keep me from asking more questions. I could tell she was hiding something, but at the time, I wasn't ready to admit it to myself. I knew something was off. I wasn't stupid, but I couldn't bring myself to confront her about it. Maybe I was afraid of what I'd find. Maybe I wasn't ready to face the truth. But Amy, she wasn't hiding it well. And Kyle, he wasn't any better. He kept texting her, keeping in touch. Little things that meant a lot more than they seemed on the surface. Every time she heard from him, I could see how it affected her. She'd get this little smile on her face, and I couldn't help but notice the way she'd light up. And I hated it. I hated it because I wasn't the one making her feel important anymore. I hated it because I knew that, somehow, Kyle had become the one who mattered. And it ate at me, slowly, painfully. But Amy wasn't ready to admit it either. She told herself that it was a mistake, that it didn't mean anything, that it was just a one-time thing. But every time she saw Kyle, every time they talked, that excuse fell apart a little more. She was giving him pieces of herself, and I was too far gone to see it. Then, things started shifting. Kyle and Amy's relationship became closer. I didn't notice it at first, or maybe I just didn't want to. But I couldn't ignore it forever. The family gatherings, which were supposed to be a chance for us to reconnect, started becoming more strained. I'd watch as Kyle and Amy would talk for hours, sharing stories, laughing, and catching up. It wasn't like before. There was a new level of intimacy there, and it wasn't something I was a part of anymore. And the worst part? She didn't even try to hide it. She'd spend hours talking to him while I sat there, trying to figure out what was happening to us. And when I asked her about it, she brushed me off. "It's just family stuff, Alex," she'd say. "You know how it is." But I didn't know. I didn't know what was going on in her head, and it made me feel like I was losing her more and more every day. Then came the worst moment, the one that really hit me. I was sitting at a family gathering, and I could see them, Amy and Kyle, laughing, touching, spending more and more time together, while I was left alone. And I started asking myself, why was this happening? Why was she distancing herself from me? Is everything okay between you two? I asked her that night, trying to get some kind of answer. She shrugged, giving me that same old excuse. "It's fine, Alex." Really? But I didn't believe her. I couldn't. And then Kyle, of course, would pop in with his usual charm. Always there, always making her smile. It was like he was planting seeds in her head, and I couldn't do anything to stop it. I had to wonder if she even realized how far things had gone. I was starting to worry about us, about our relationship, but there was nothing I could do to fix it. Not when she was so wrapped up in her own thoughts, so lost in whatever Kyle was giving her. She wasn't interested in saving us. She was interested in whatever escape she'd found. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about a one-time mistake. This was the beginning of something much worse. The moment I saw that message, everything clicked into place. I had been blind to it for so long, ignoring the small signs and the subtle distance growing between us. But now, there was no denying it. The photo was clear. Amy and Kyle, standing close together, kissing. It was taken during one of their secret meetings, the kind I had never known about. At first, I didn't believe it. I thought it had to be some kind of sick joke, but deep down, I knew better. I could feel it. I didn't react right away. I couldn't. I had to make sure I wasn't jumping to conclusions. I had to gather evidence. And that's exactly what I did. I started by checking Amy's phone. At first, it was like searching for something I didn't want to find, hoping, yet knowing, that I would find more than I could handle. And I did. Text after text, I read through them, each one more damning than the last. Words of affection, plans to meet up, even little inside jokes that made it clear this wasn't just a fling or a one-time mistake. This was something deeper, something serious. The disappointment I felt wasn't just from the affair itself. It was the betrayal. The years we had spent together, the trust one thought we had built, all of it had been shattered in an instant. I couldn't believe it, but at the same time, I was furious. Furious at her for throwing everything away, and furious at Kyle for being the one to take what wasn't his. I knew what I had to do next. I wasn't going to just sit back and let this slide. I had spent too much time in this relationship to let it end like this. My reputation, my family's reputation, it was all at stake. But I wasn't going to let Amy and Kyle get away with this. Not without consequences. I started by gathering information about Kyle. I had to understand who he really was, what his weaknesses were. He was charming, sure, but I wasn't about to let that be his shield. I reached out to people I knew, family members, friends, even acquaintances who might have information about him. I wasn't being subtle about it. I wasn't being quiet. If Kyle thought he could just waltz into my life and destroy everything I had, then he was wrong. I needed to restore my family's reputation, and to do that, I had to make sure everyone saw Kyle for who he really was. A manipulative, morally questionable person who didn't deserve the trust of anyone. I wasn't going to let him keep playing this game with Amy, with my family. I had a plan. It started at the next family gathering. I wasn't going to let it be obvious, but I needed to plant the seeds. I started talking to my sister, Linda. I knew she was close with Kyle, but I also knew she had a good sense of judgment. I told her I had suspicions about Kyle, that something didn't feel right. She was hesitant at first, telling me I was overreacting. But as the conversation went on, I made sure to drop enough details to make her start questioning him. "Are you sure about him, Linda?" I asked. "I just don't trust him. There's something off about him, and it's not just me." At first, she brushed it off. But the more we talked, the more she started to notice things herself. She told me about little oddities in Kyle's behavior, things she hadn't thought much about before. It was working. Slowly, Linda began to have doubts, and that was all I needed. I knew she wasn't the only one in the family who had been fooled by Kyle's charm. He had that effect on people. But with Linda's support, I was able to slowly turn other family members against him. I started talking to my father, Thomas. I dropped hints about Kyle's behavior, how he seemed to have a tendency to take advantage of people, how his attention always seemed to be on the wrong things. At first, Thomas didn't believe me. He defended Kyle, said he was just being himself, that he wasn't as bad as I was making him out to be. But I didn't give up. I kept pushing, feeding him just enough to make him start questioning Kyle's intentions. It wasn't long before Thomas started noticing things too. Subtle things. The way Kyle acted around my mother, the way he seemed to always have a hidden agenda. It wasn't just about talking to people. It was about creating an atmosphere, a climate of doubt where Kyle started to seem less like the charming cousin and more like the manipulative opportunist I knew he was. I didn't want people to see him for who they thought he was. I wanted them to see him for what he really was. There was something satisfying about watching it unfold. The way people started looking at Kyle with suspicion. The way they started distancing themselves from him, just a little at a time. It felt like control, like I was finally taking back what had been stolen from me. But it wasn't all easy. The more I dug, the more I realized how deep this ran. Amy wasn't just emotionally invested in Kyle. She had allowed herself to believe that he was the answer to everything she had been lacking. And the deeper I got into the web of their relationship, the more I realized how much of it was built on lies. I wasn't done yet. I had just started, and I wasn't going to stop until I had exposed Kyle for who he really was. There was one more thing I had to do. One person I needed to talk to. Josh. He had been my friend for years, and I knew he would be honest with me. I wasn't sure what he'd think of my plan, but I needed advice. I wasn't about to let things get out of hand without considering the consequences. We met at a bar one evening, and I laid it all out for him. Every detail. The affair. The lies. My plan to ruin Kyle's reputation and tear apart the life Amy had been building with him. Josh listened quietly, sipping his drink. When I finished, he looked at me with a mixture of concern and disbelief. "Alex," he said, "I get that you're hurt. I really do. But you're playing with fire here. You're not just risking your marriage. You're risking your entire family. You're gonna destroy everything just to get revenge?" I didn't answer right away. I just stared at him, thinking about all the years I'd spent with Amy, the years I'd spent building this life. She had taken that from me. She had chosen Kyle. "I'm not going to let them get away with it," I said, my voice cold. "I'm going to make sure everyone knows the truth." Josh looked at me, then shook his head. "You're sure about this?" "I'm sure," I replied. And with that, I knew I was past the point of no return. I was going to make them pay. The days after I found out about Amy and Kyle's affair were a blur, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let this go. The anger inside me was like a slow burn, but it was the betrayal that hurt the most. Amy had taken everything we had, everything we built, and thrown it away for him. And now, I was going to make sure everyone knew the truth. It wasn't going to happen overnight, though. I had to be strategic. The first step was planting the seeds of doubt. I didn't want to come off as paranoid or obsessive. I had to make people question Kyle's character without making it obvious. It had to be subtle. One evening, at a family dinner, I casually mentioned to my father, Thomas, how distant Amy and I had become. I didn't go into detail about the affair. I didn't need to. I just needed to get the conversation going. "I don't know, Dad," I said as we sat down to eat. "Amy and I haven't been connecting lately. She's been so wrapped up in work, and I think she's been talking to Kyle a lot more than she's letting on. I don't know, just feels like there's something off about it." Thomas, who had always respected Kyle, looked at me, confused. "What do you mean by that?" I shrugged, trying to keep it casual. "You know, he's been a bit too involved in our business lately. Not just with Amy's work, but with personal stuff too. I'm not saying it's anything, but you've got to admit, it's a bit weird." He paused, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, but I could see the wheels turning in his head. He was beginning to doubt Kyle. That was all I needed. Later that night, I made sure to speak with my sister, Linda. She had always been close to Kyle, but I knew that if I planted the right doubts, she'd start noticing the same things I had. I told her about how I'd been feeling disconnected from Amy and about the strange behavior I'd seen in Kyle lately. I didn't outright accuse him of anything. I just let the suggestion hang in the air, hoping it would take root. At first, Linda seemed skeptical. "Alex, you know how Kyle is. He's always been a bit of a flirt, but that's just who he is." I nodded, playing along. "Yeah, I get that. But don't you think it's a little much? Especially when it comes to Amy?" That was all it took. Over the next few days, I kept subtly bringing up Kyle's actions. How he always seemed to make everything about him. How he had a tendency to insert himself into situations that weren't his business. Slowly but surely, Linda started to doubt him. She wasn't ready to fully believe that he was capable of something so sinister, but the doubts were there, simmering beneath the surface. And then came the family gathering where I knew I would finally make my move. I had prepared myself for this moment, rehearsing what I would say, how I would do it. The plan was simple. Expose Kyle in front of everyone. Let them see him for the liar he was. No more subtle hints. No more second-guessing. I was going to lay it all out. I waited until the perfect moment during the dinner. Everyone was talking, laughing, eating, and for once, I had everyone's attention. I stood up, cleared my throat, and opened my phone. My hand was shaking, but I didn't care. I had to do this. "I've got something I need to show you all," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The room fell silent, and all eyes were on me. I showed them the photo. Amy and Kyle, locked in a kiss. It was as clear as day. There was no denying it. I didn't let anyone speak until I had finished. Slowly, I went through the timeline, explaining how I had discovered everything. The texts, the lies, the way they'd been sneaking around behind my back. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I kept my composure. My father's face was the first to change. His mouth dropped open as he processed what I was saying. He looked from me to the photo, then back to me. "This can't be true," he whispered. But it was. "I don't know how long this has been going on," I continued, my voice now thick with rage, "but I've had enough. I'm not going to sit here and let Kyle destroy our family. I'm not going to sit back and let this go." Thomas was silent for a moment, his face a mix of disbelief and anger. Kyle, my own nephew. The room was dead quiet. Some people were staring at the photo, others at me, unsure of how to react. It was a heavy silence, filled with confusion, shock, and betrayal. Finally, Kyle tried to speak. "Alex, it was just a mistake. A one-time thing," he said quickly, trying to defend himself. "I was in a vulnerable place, and so was Amy. It didn't mean anything. We're both sorry." But no one was listening to him. Not anymore. The damage was done. His words were hollow, empty. Linda was the first to stand up, tears streaming down her face. "How could you do this to the family?" she cried, her voice trembling. "How could you betray Alex like that? I can't believe this." Kyle tried to grab her arm, but she yanked it away, shaking her head in disbelief. "I don't want to hear it. I don't want to see you again." Kyle stood there, frozen, as Linda turned and walked away. The room was still buzzing with shock and anger, but Kyle didn't move. He was defeated. And then there was Amy, sitting in the corner, her face pale, her hands trembling. She hadn't said anything yet, but I could see the look in her eyes. She knew it was over. Everything she had worked to protect was falling apart. Slowly, she stood up and approached me, but I turned away before she could speak. "Amy," I said, my voice cold, "don't even try to apologize. You've already ruined everything. There's no coming back from this." She froze, tears welling in her eyes, but I didn't want to see it. She wasn't my wife anymore. She wasn't the woman I married. She was just a stranger to me now. The family was in chaos. People were angry, confused, trying to figure out what to do next. But I didn't care about them. I didn't care about anyone anymore. I had exposed Kyle for what he was, and I had taken back control of my life. Later that night, when everyone had left and the house was quiet, Amy came to me one last time. She begged for forgiveness. "I'm sorry, Alex," she whispered. "I didn't mean for things to get this far. It was a terrible mistake. Please, I'll do anything to fix this. We can start over. I looked at her, but all I felt was anger. Deep, seething anger that burned inside me. I wasn't going to forgive her. I wasn't going to forget what she had done. It's too late, I said, my voice flat. There's no future for us anymore. And just like that, I knew it was over. I had won. But somehow, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a hollow victory. Something I didn't want anymore. Something I couldn't even enjoy. The days after the revelation were a blur for Amy. She had never imagined things would spiral out of control like this. The weight of her betrayal settled on her shoulders, crushing her from all sides. Her friends began to distance themselves. Some of them, out of disgust, while others chose Alex's side, believing that what she had done was unforgivable. She was left with no one but herself to blame for the mess she had created. She reached out to Kyle in desperation. Her phone was flooded with unanswered messages from him, but every time she checked, he was silent. Kyle had disappeared, emotionally and physically. He refused to speak to her, too ashamed to even face her after everything had been exposed. Amy tried to convince herself that it was just a phase, that things could be fixed. But Kyle's cold indifference told her otherwise. He didn't want to be a part of the mess anymore. As much as Amy tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, it was impossible. Every time she left the house, she was met with stares and whispers. The neighbors who had once been friendly now avoided eye contact, and strangers in the store would gossip as she walked by. She had become a pariah in her own town, and the feeling of isolation was overwhelming. Her own actions had created a wall between her and the world. It was a lonely existence, and she realized, too late, just how much she had lost. Meanwhile, Kyle, unable to face the wrath of the family, decided to leave town. It wasn't dramatic, no big farewell or confrontation. He packed his things quietly, slipping away without drawing attention. His departure went unnoticed by everyone except Alex. As much as Alex had hoped for some kind of resolution, he felt a strange sense of relief knowing that Kyle was no longer a part of his life. Kyle's absence meant he no longer had to face the constant reminder of his cousin's betrayal. Kyle had tried to meet with Alex one last time, hoping to apologize and make amends, but Alex refused to meet him. There was nothing left to say. Kyle had destroyed everything, and Alex wasn't willing to give him another chance to explain himself. Before he left, Kyle left a note for Amy, telling her he was going. But Amy never received it. She was too lost in her own despair, too absorbed in the fallout of her actions. She couldn't bring herself to read anything from Kyle, even if it meant closure. By the time she realized he had gone, it was too late. Kyle had already disappeared from her life, leaving her with nothing. Kyle's departure marked the end of the affair, but it also symbolized the end of everything he had thought he could salvage. He had lost his family, his dignity, and the woman he had thought he loved. In the end, he was left with nothing but his own regret. As for Alex, he knew that the battle with his emotions was far from over. After the family confrontation, he slowly began to rebuild his life. The support from his father and sister, though never fully restored to the way it was before, helped him move forward. They had begun to understand the full extent of the betrayal, and though their relationship with Amy would never be the same, they had come to see the situation for what it truly was. Alex also started seeing a counselor, working through the emotional wounds that the affair had left behind. The anger that had fueled his revenge began to subside, replaced with a more profound sadness, a sorrow for what could have been. He realized that revenge had been satisfying, yes, but it hadn't healed the wounds. It hadn't brought him peace. Slowly, Alex began to focus on his own growth. He took time for himself, rediscovered old hobbies and passions that had been pushed aside for far too long. He found new friendships and started building a career that he could be proud of. The pain of the betrayal would never fully go away, but he learned to appreciate his own worth. And in doing so, he began to grow stronger, bit by bit, letting go of the anger that had once consumed him. Then came the final break. Amy came to Alex's house one last time, trying to retrieve some of her belongings. She looked different, broken. The confident, beautiful woman who had once been so full of life was now a shadow of herself. She looked at Alex with pleading eyes, begging him to understand that it had been a mistake, that she was sorry, that she could make things right. "I never meant for it to go this far," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Please, Alex. Please, just give me one more chance." Alex looked at her, really looked at her, and felt nothing. The rage had faded, replaced with a quiet certainty. "It's too late," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I can't forgive you. I can't go back to that. We have no future together." Amy's face crumpled with despair. She stood there, hoping he would change his mind, but Alex didn't waver. She had lost him for good. She had lost everything. She left without a word, knowing deep down that she would never return. As she walked away, her heart heavy with the weight of her mistakes, the realization hit her. She had destroyed her marriage. She had destroyed her family. And now, she had nothing left. The next few months passed in a blur for Amy. The loneliness she had once felt became even more profound. The friends she had once relied on were gone, and the family she had betrayed would never welcome her back. The house she had once shared with Alex now felt like a prison, a constant reminder of everything she had thrown away. As time went on, Alex found peace. He moved forward, not because he had forgiven, but because he had learned to let go. He couldn't change the past, but he could shape his future. And in that future, there was no place for Amy. She was a memory, a painful, bitter memory that he had finally allowed himself to move on from. For Amy, there was no such resolution. Her life had been shattered, and she could never put the pieces back together. The consequences of her choices had come crashing down on her, and there was no turning back. She would live with the weight of her mistakes for the rest of her life.